Meu nome é Pedro Nascimento, eu faço parte do conselho editorial da MIT Sloan Review Brasil, sou CEO da holding Anga Dynamo e vou estar conduzindo esse nosso Roundtable de hoje. Vale destacar já de começo que esse Roundtable vai ser em inglês. Então, toda a nossa discussão, todas as conversas que a gente vai ter vão ser absolutamente conduzidas em inglês. Eu só estou fazendo uma breve introdução em português. Se você preferir assistir esse nosso Roundtable de hoje em português, no próprio YouTube tem fixado no topo da lista de comentários um link para você acessar a tradução simultânea. Então, a gente tem uma pessoa do nosso time que está naturalmente, ouvindo toda essa nossa conversa, vai estar fazendo essa tradução. Se você preferir, sem problema, pode acessar por lá. Mas se quiser, obviamente, fazer algum tipo de interação, fazer uma pergunta, eu peço só que mande nessa caixa de comentários aqui, porque, enfim, vai ficar muito mais fácil para a gente acessar e eu conseguir direcionar para algum dos nossos palestrantes. Tudo bem? Dito isso, vou alterar já a minha língua utilizada ao longo do nosso webinar para inglês, justamente para em breve poder fazer a introdução dos nossos convidados e falar um pouco do tema. Lembrando que o nosso Roundtable de hoje tem um tema super interessante, super relevante de finanças em tempos de dados. Tudo mudou, menos a sua empresa. So, again, changing to English. So, we know for a fact that reliability and speed are two pillars in any financial business today. The main assets of those institutions of course, is the data that they can gather of their clients, of their partners, and of their channels in general. And this data is an important asset, whether for processing, for integration, for experience, for compliance, or even for competitiveness with another companies and at this time, probably not even other financial companies, but companies in general that are starting to enter the market, the financial market, in many ways. And the thing that we want to talk about today is, the most admired companies have already adapted to this world of data we're living now. And what about your company? What about the company you work for right now? Are you adapted to it? Are you ready for competitiveness in this world that we're living currently? So to discuss these key points of the transformation of finance in the data era, MIT Sloan Review and InterSystems, we're presenting this roundtable where we will talk about the importance of using real-time analytics for decision-making from consistent data. We'll talk about risk management, and we'll talk about how to support business decisions using it. We'll talk also about data governance, about how to ensure time to value, how to have valuable data practices in volatile scenarios. So it's an important topic, and it's a topic that it's not only important, for people that work currently in the financial sector. And I'm saying that because this is some of the, this broader vision is some of the points that my two amazing speakers can bring to us today. So I'm honored to introduce both of our speakers today. The first one is Ricardo Amorim, which has this amazing bio that, of course, I wouldn't even need probably to present him, but I'll do it because I'll have the honor of doing it. He's the most influential economist in Brazil, one of the 100 most influential people in the country, according to Forbes magazine. The only Brazilian included among the best speakers in the world by Speaker's Corner, co-founder of Smart Trips, a Inovação and Mentoria Ricardo Amorim, most followed Latin American influencer on LinkedIn and top voice influencer of LinkedIn in Brazil since 2016, winner of the most admired awards from the Economy, Business, and Finance Press in 2017 from 2020, and winner of the IBEST Award for Best in Brazilian Economics and Business by popular vote, and second place in the IBEST Expert Jury Award in 2020, ahead of the largest media groups in the country. Of course, I could spend at least 15 minutes more talking about what Ricardo Amorim does, but we will be able to catch some of his wisdom during this conversation. Ricardo, it's an honor to have you here. Thank you for being part of this roundtable.
My honor, and listening to what you're saying about my CV, I feel much smarter than I actually am.
We'll see about that during the next hour. So to talk with Ricardo about this topic today, I'd like to introduce my second speaker for today, which is Michael Hom, the head of financial services solutions at InterSystems. He's a technology executive with over 25 years of experience working in financial services industry. So prior to joining InterSystems, Michael was a managing director managing global rates, securitized products, and municipal technologies at the Royal Bank of Canada Capital Markets. Previously, he was an executive director overseeing cross-product technologies, including risk, sales, and trade management, and Nomura Securities. Michael started his career at Lehman Brothers, building systems in the rates, foreign exchange, and emerging market areas. Later on, he became senior vice president, leading securitized products, whole loans, real estate, and principal finance technologies. He holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from Columbia University School of Engineering and Applied Science, and he's our second speaker for today. So, Michael, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Perfect. So, just before I start the questions to our speakers, I'd like to share that anyone can, post not only comments but questions in the comment section in YouTube. So if there's anything you'd like to ask Ricardo or Michael, please feel free to send it directly in the comment section of YouTube. I can see everything over here, and I'll direct it to Ricardo and Michael. So, since Ricardo already joked about how the CV maybe sounds, even more smarter than he is, even though I'm pretty sure it's not the case. I like to start with, not a difficult question, but one that's kind of, in a way, maybe philosophical, or, you can understand it the best way you like, which is, we're talking about data in finance, and, both are themes that I know you're pretty comfortable talking about. And one of the interesting parts of, the business model that are, being driven by data right now is, for, probably since we invented management, there was this, maybe this trade-off between speed and quality of our decision-making, right? We always talked about, I remember when I studied management in college, we always talked about, you can either have speed, efficiency, and everything like that, or quality and being a good decision-making process, or things like that. And my first question to you is, is it possible right now to break free of this, eternal trade-off that we always had in management between speed and quality or reliability or stuff like that, given the fact that both of them are pretty important to be competitive in a world, inundated by data?
I don't have any doubts that it is possible. And the first reason is that I think that a big shift has happened. When the problem that we had in the past was difficulty of gathering data and not enough data to take decisions, you needed more time, because that was the time that was necessary to gather this data, to analyze this data, and to get to the best conclusion. Nowadays, the problem is exactly the opposite. It's not a lack of data, it's excess of data. So how to deal with it? The first thing is that you need to automatize the whole process in a way that you can, at the same time, gather and analyze. And the tools are available for that, and they have been available for a long time, especially AI, especially artificial intelligence. The difference is that as time goes by and the computing power of computers goes up, the ability to transform data into insight has evolved a lot. And that's something that I know a little bit, because back in 1993, I used to use artificial intelligence models to forecast what would happen with Brazil's financial markets, more specifically with the FX rate and the stock exchange. The difference is that from 1993 up to today, the average speed of computers, based on Moore's law, that every 2 years or every 18 months, it basically doubles. Now it's roughly 32 times faster, the computers in average, than the ones that I used to help me at that point. And by the way, artificial intelligence has been available much before I used. It was back in the 60s. And as compared to the 60s, now computers are more than 200 million times faster than they used to be. And probably not too far away, we're going to have quantum computing, which in just one shift, this is going to increase more than it has increased since the beginning of artificial intelligence. So my whole point is, even as of today, it's already possible to take fast decisions and accurate decisions. And this is going to become more and more possible as time goes by.
Michael, I suppose that's probably something that people ask you a lot, right? How can I make better decisions and at the same time I want to make them as quickly as possible? So how do you tackle those challenges, in all the interactions you have with clients?
Well, I think Ricardo kind of like clearly kind of made the foundational statements there, right? Like technology today has enabled that, right? So there's no real excuse why you can't process all the data that you have at speed, and also ensuring that there's quality, right? So, from our perspective, in working with our customers and trying to solve for exactly that, we focus on enablement and agility as two primary kind of goals, right? So if you think about, what does that really mean? Well, it's making sure that you have good data to begin with, right? So that's part of it. You make sure that you can capture all the data that you need, but then you also need to be able to use it. And I think that's a key point that may differentiate a lot of folks today, right? Everyone has the same capabilities all about where, they all have access to the same hardware and so forth, but it's really now, how do you use that data appropriately, right? So, to enable yourself, and also to make sure that you can provide agility to your business, you need to think about how you can actually keep your data all integrated in some form, right? So you need to make sure that you can monitor your data, govern your data across, right? That's one aspect. And then, talking about enablement, you want to make sure you actually understand what you have, right? To Ricardo's point, there's no shortage of data anymore, but having too much data is a problem too. So you kind of think you need to make sure that you understand the context of your data, understand the relationships that are there, making sure you understand what you have, like how good is the data that you have, right? Because that's very key. So that brings into the quality equation, right? So if you kind of have those two parts as an enablement piece, now you talk about agility, right? As much as we have all the same access to the same hardware, it's really making sure that you can harness that properly and provide the speed and scale to be able to handle the market volatilities that goes, and also scale as your business scales, right? The last point I think that is critical here is agility. So if you think about having all that data, if you can't use it and it can't adapt to your new requirements as it comes, then it's almost, again, kind of useless, because it's a very competitive market. As the world continues to shift more toward data-driven decisioning, the competition is also growing too. So you need to make sure that you can adapt to new situations super fast, and be able to analyze all that data with the speed and ensuring that you also have that quality.
Perfect.
Pedro, could I quickly add a couple of points which I think that are key as well? The first one is that I think that a key point to that is the only way to have speed and accuracy in decision making is if you have you've done your homework. So the key point is you will not have speed and accuracy if you decide that now I need to decide on something that previously you didn't do everything that Michael has already said. Because if you priorly you didn't work to have good data, to have the analytical tools, and to have the dashboards that can provide the speed and accuracy, it won't happen. So I think that's the point number one. The point number two is quite often what I see is that people take the available data and try to get the insights from the data that is easy to collect. And I think that's a big mistake, because sometimes it does work well, but sometimes it's the opposite. The most easily to collect data is not the one that is going to provide the answers that you need. So I think you need to reverse the process, which is, what is the question that would really, if answered, would really make a big difference in your business? And what is the data that could provide this answer? And then you need to build the process to generate the data that you need to learn. That's the way to build a learning organization and something that is going to be better and better going forward. And so that's the second point that I would make. And the third one is to be very conscious of what the data can tell you and what it cannot tell you. Because quite often what happens is that people are trying to look to some information that is not in the data, could not be in the data, and because of that, they actually come to the wrong conclusions. There is a very interesting story that happened in World War II, which is at a certain point, by the way, this was a war that basically, it was the first war, the airplanes were key. And the Americans, trying to get an edge, decided to reinforce their crafts. The problem was that there was not steel enough to reinforce all the crafts, and on top of it, all the aircrafts, and on top of it, the aircrafts would be too heavy if the whole machine had extra layers to be able actually to withstand more firing from the Nazi airplanes. So what they did, they took the airplanes and they started mapping out where the airplanes were shot. And they had a map with an airplane with all the points that they were shot. The first conclusion was, let's reinforce all the points that have many shots. Until a mathematician came and said, you're absolutely wrong. It's exactly the opposite. Because the airplanes that you're looking at are the airplanes that came back. The ones that were shot in the points that you don't see the shots are the ones that actually were not able to come back. So basically, you need to reinforce where there are no points, what is out of the data. And that was because of survivorship bias. But that's just one example that you really need to understand the context of your data. Otherwise, you're going to probably take exactly the wrong decisions.
You know, I love this example, Ricardo, because I was reading actually an example about data in financial markets like earlier today about this company where they were developing this model for risk management, for, having credit scores for people. And after a while, they noticed that they were only using in the model people that already had been vetted from someone inside the bank. So people had been vetted, and after that, they started to collect information about it. Of course, there's a lot of bias in that because it's, 99% of people that were looking for credit inside the company, didn't got into the model anyhow. So I think that's pretty interesting what you're trying. So what our data is not saying that we should listen, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a really key point when you think about how you start training models and you refine your models and your completeness of your data and the diversity of your data that you pull in, matters a lot, right? If you're only taking like say one data point or 2 data points, then obviously there's going to be some anomalies that come out of it. So, it's a lot. We talk about storing as much as you can, but there's logistical issues around that. But there is a real good case to be said about making sure that you run your tests, right? You do a testing of the models to make sure that there's no bias, right, around the model itself, and having many eyes into it, and just try and make sure that you are utilizing your data correctly.
Pedro, if I could come to your example in terms of risk management in financial institutions, one thing that I think that especially fintechs that are challenging some of the big banks in Brazil should be quite aware is of adverse selection in terms of who apply for credit with them. Because quite often what happens is the guys who already were not able to get credit with some of the most big and traditional institutions are exactly the ones that are applying for credit in those new institutions that are offering them credit. So you're getting actually obviously that's a generalization, but as a generalization, in average, you're getting the worst possible clients. And you should be aware of that, because otherwise you'll probably run into trouble.
Interesting. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of adverse selection in there. And my follow-up question to that would be, what for? When we're talking about, collecting data and data points and everything like that. So from your experience, and I love to hear Michael, working with a lot of clients, but of course, Ricardo, which knows a lot about the financial market in Brazil, what for? Using them for, just to analyze credit, or there are some interesting ways of looking at data that you're aware of? And I'm asking that because two examples came to my mind. So for example, we know for a fact that even though banks generally collect a lot of data regarding risk, there are some interesting banks in Brazil that are focusing on collecting data regarding customer, interactions to work with, customer experience, which is not that much of a thing, 10 years ago when we talk about data collection in banks, right? And there's this second example that I like to add up. I was talking with this, this fintech, where one of the data points that they collected regarding risk was the time the person spent reading the contract. Because they noticed that if someone, spent 30 seconds reading, probably it was going to default. Probably the person wasn't really, taking that much care about what was going on. So what I'd like to ask you is, what are some interesting uses for it? Since we're already living the only, the traditional risk management models inside of financial institutions.
I guess that depends on the sector. I think there's a lot of interesting cases abroad, right? Like, anytime you use data, it's we're shifting from a model where everything was done by humans, right? Now we're shifting using data to be able to have that augmented with a lot of machinery, right? But also you can have it fully automated, have it autonomous in certain cases, right? So like in the sales and trading world, I would say that algorithmic trading to me is a very interesting example, right? Like that's been going on for a while. And I think, just recently, I think there's a large uptick in it, due to the pandemic and being able to do things kind of more autonomously. I think that's a really good example of how people have used data, right? Think about the efficiencies, think about the speed that one can do, right? One trading model can outperform speed-wise 10 or 20 traders, right? So you think about that processing, there's no competition there. When maybe if you shift to a different sector and you look at retail, maybe wealth management and insurance, it's a lot to do with hyper-personalization, where with all that data, so structured, unstructured, social data, some health data, every single data point that you can grab, bring that all together and being able to know what a customer will want or need in advance, and having that rich conversation, virtually or augmented with a human is a great advancement in my eyes. Like I think that that whole ability to tailor solutions now to people versus just bucketing them into general categories and saying that you're that, right? I think that's a great evolution for our customer, but also for companies as they start to evolve.
My impression is that when you say what for, it should be two things. The first one is to better understand your customers, and the second one is to better understand your market. And actually, there's a third one, is to improve your process. Anything that data can help you improve any of these points, this will improve your business. This will make your results better. This will reduce your risk. And again, in order to do that in practice, you need to understand what data can do and what it can't. That reminds me of an old story. Back in 1994, I used to work at Banco Fenicia, which was a small bank from Arapuã, which at that point was the largest retail store in Brazil. And at that same point, it was the first time that banks were required to have their own risk management systems. Until then, there was no requirement, there was no Basel rules requiring banks to have any kind of risk management. And the interesting thing is, initially, banks were doing that just because of regulation. They didn't think it was worth, it would help them in anything. And I know all that because I was the one who implemented that in my bank. I was at that point the head of economics and quant research at the bank. And they said, oh, since you are the one who will generate all the hypotheses for the model, which was the economic expectations for the model, and you already deal with quant, so you build the model. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And I started doing deep research in order to do that. And I said, I want to talk to guys abroad who have done that before. We here in Brazil. And I said, no, that's not necessary. It's only so that regulators are okay with it. And it was not my bank, because I talked to everybody else in the market. That was basically what most banks were dealing at that point. And we had an additional problem, because that was back in 1994, when Brazil introduced Plano Real, which was the economic plan that changed, the currency was changed in Brazil, Michael, at that point, and inflation up to 1 month prior to, until June of 1994, was in the vicinities of 80% per month. And then we were able to bring inflation down, but my whole point was that I knew I was working with a data series of something that was a reality that was totally different from what we were living. So I knew that what I had there was, that doesn't really, there was a structural shift in the middle. And I said, that doesn't really make any sense. I said, that's okay, that's only for the regulator. So my whole point with all that is, the good news is this has totally shifted. There is no financial institutions that doesn't invest as it should in risk management. And why? Because it improves its business. So let's get back to the point. Why doing that? Because it does make a lot of difference.
Well, there's that risk reward aspect, right? So you want to manage your risk as you want to grow your revenue, but manage your risk, right? It's not one or the other. And I think another use case that is kind of interesting is fraud detection, right? Like once you have all that data and you can compile that across, we were speaking to a customer and doing it within one company, right? You can do it within one product area. What if you cross across your whole company, right, globally, and you can now detect these more sophisticated kind of schemes that criminals are doing, where you're passing money through various entities even within one organization, but now you can actually spot it, and you can't honestly do that today if you weren't collecting all that data and if you didn't have a very good way of processing that with speed. And then the further on that, it's like we're doing it within one company. What would be better if you could do it across companies, right? Because criminals are just getting more sophisticated as it goes, and so they're passing money across multiple companies, across different products. Here's a great use case for a proper system using your data across all the firms. Obviously, you need to have some governance over it, but I think there's a lot of great use cases that you can have. If you can know what you have, you can make sure that you can use that data appropriately.
And another thing that I wanted to ask about, this using data and data management side of things is, what to look for. What to collect, because, for example, Michael, when you were talking about insurance, you talked about, social data, which is interesting because, it makes a lot of sense because it has to do with lifestyle decisions, right? So the thing I wanted to ask is, what to look for in your experience, what to collect, because it's not about, again, going to the ancient risk models and the stuff that Ricardo had to do in 1994. It's not anymore looking at a historical series, hope there's not a currency change in the middle of it, and try to extrapolate it to the future. So what do you see organizations looking for? Is there only product data? It's data about, interactions with customers. It's things that are not inside the company. It's third-party data. What to look for?
That's a tough one, right? Because it all depends on what you're trying to do. And I think at this discrete level, you want rich data, you want a very diverse set of data, and you also want to make sure that it's very clean, right? You can talk about the V's of data, but that really rings true that you need to make sure that for every single step that you now incorporate one additional data set, you need to make sure that you verify and understand what you're trying to do there, right? To Ricardo's point earlier on, just like, don't just add everything in, right? If you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what the outcome will be. And so it's really about making sure that you have access to all that data, but then utilize it, understand what you have, and utilize it appropriately. And it can be iterative, right? Sometimes you can find a correlation that wasn't there. Sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. But it's all about that agility to be able to use certain data sets, use it at, whether it's structured, unstructured, whether it's customer data, if it's market data, whether it's fast moving or historical, you want to be able to you have access to all that. But also you need to make sure that you can do something with it at the end. So kind of like a kind of roundabout answer to the question, because we want all of it, right? As much as you have, but you need to make sure that you understand what you have and you use it appropriately.
Makes sense. Yeah.
I think that what I would say is that you need to look for data that can improve your knowledge, which means something that can either confirm or actually prove wrong something that you believed. In that sense, you need to find data. And the second point is ideally data that could make you learn something that other people and other institutions don't know, because the value of knowing what everybody knows is limited. The value of knowing what only you know is immense. Let me be more specific. If I give you a series which is 2, 4, 6, 8, and I want you to tell me, you can give me other numbers to check your hypothesis of what is the logic behind the series. Usually what people say, okay, is the other number is 10? I said, yeah, it could be 10. And then 12? Yeah, it could be 12. And they say, oh, I know. It's the numbers are going up 2 by 2. I say, no, the numbers are just going up. But in order to know that, you should have asked something to me, which is, could the other number be 22? I said, yes. And then you would think, oh, it's not what I was thinking. You need to ask what would disprove what you thought before. Because if you're only looking for data that confirms what you already thought before, you will not learn anything new. So I think this is absolutely key. And the second point, which I think it's important that Michael touched, which is to understand what not only the data, but what the model can do, cannot do, and will do. And I'll give you, again, another example of this when I used AI to forecast what the financial markets would do in Brazil. So based on all the training that I had on everything, I had a certain understanding of how often the model would be right and wrong, and what happened when it was right and wrong. In a nutshell, the model I had was able to being correct in terms of the market direction relatively often. There's only one important caveat. When it was wrong, because it was a trading model, when it was wrong, it lost much more money than when it was right. Still, given that it was right much more often than it was wrong, by the end of the day, in a long term, it makes some money. But it was not that it was not something that, oh, now I have something that is right every single time. But by an enormous coincidence, the first month that I put the model to practice, I remember until today, there were 23 working days in Brazil in that month. Of those 23 days, the model was right 20 days. And the 3 days that he lost money, he didn't lose much money. So basically, all the traders in the bank thought that we had found the holy grail. I said, no, the only thing to do is to follow Ricardo's model and we're all going to be rich. And I said, no, that's not what happened. And so I was very afraid because I knew the limitations of my model, but they didn't. And then I come to the head trader and said, you need to tell those guys not basically to copycat my model because I know it will not be as good as this. And more than that, they're going to be right 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days in a row. In the 7th, they are going to bet big and they're going to lose really, really big. And so I started being very scared because the first thing that you need to know is the limitations of the data, and not only the data, the models.
And another question that I want to ask you is, how do those data practices that you've been sharing a lot can contribute, to reduce the time to value? That is the time it takes for the client itself to realize the value of your offer. How can this help?
Who is that? Is that to Ricardo or to me?
You can start.
Okay. So let's see. So how can it help? So if you have good, clean data, I think, from a time to value standpoint, you can prepare, you have faster preparation already, right? So you have better scenario analysis. I think, as we spoke before, I think you have better understanding of your customer. You understand the risk reward and the value proposition a lot more. Now that just helps you overall to make a more informed decision, right? Or much more targeted approach to opportunities, right? And I think that in essence kind of really makes you be able to have better insights and to make smarter decisions as you go. I think those are just core things that there's so many benefits to having, again, good clean data, but being able to use that, right? It opens up a whole bunch of abilities from a business standpoint. And I say kind of like a lot of times where if you have a platform agility, you have data agility, and then that leads to business agility and being able to do all sorts of things from that. And I think with this day and age where there's so much competition, things are moving so fast now with technology, it's just like you need to be able to adapt and pivot very quickly. And I think those are the key pieces for me.
My impression is that the key point is to help better understand what your client wants. Because if you know what the client wants, you're going to first be able to offer the best product that he or she needs. And the second one is you're going to be able to market it better in the sense that not only you offer something that is what he or she wants, but on top of it, you can show them that that's what they need because you already know what they want. So I think that if data can help you give this kind of information, you really have a big competitive advantage, and you're going to improve your conversion, both in terms of the number of prospects that will become clients, and also the time to value, as you mentioned.
I'd like to shift a little bit the focus of our conversation. We're talking a lot about how to use data to generate, value to clients and time to market and stuff like that. And the thing I wanted to ask is about, security. Michael, Ricardo knows this since he's Brazilian, but there was this time, probably by the beginning of the year, where we had the leak of the week. You probably remember that, Ricardo. Some institution in Brazil had a huge data leak, and there's already even sites where you can see how many times your data have been leaked by some institution. And there has been a leak in the site that look for leaks in another institution. So we had this crazy thing happening in Brazil by the beginning of the year, where I think in a way was a wake up call regarding the importance of security, of data governance, and of things like that. So I'd like just to start the topic by what companies should be looking for, how could they be preparing for it, because we're talking a lot about using it to create value, but there's also the downside of having a lot of data, right? I've heard from a colleague once that data was the new oil. Now people are saying it's the new uranium. It can generate a lot of revenue, but it can kill you as well. So what's your insights in that, in data security, in this world full with a lot of data?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point there. As much as you're accumulating all this rich and valuable data and trying to make proper use of it for a competitive advantage, if you don't secure your data, obviously, and someone steals it, and so that there's reputational risk there. There's obviously regulatory fines that potentially might come across. There's monetary risk, right? So if you lose your data, obviously that's you can lose your customers. You can have shareholder trust issues. That's a tough one, and I think people are there's conversations around, as much as it's great to have all this data, there's conversations having too much data, and then use it and then destroy it, not accumulate. So I think that there's arguments for both sides. At a certain point, the amount of data that we have is ever growing, right? And at a certain point, you kind of says, well, what are you going to do with all of it, right? If you don't, again, come back to context, it's almost useless. And part of it also is that data becomes stale. And so if you kind of don't really think about what you have, it can be a big mess. And I think that comes to the governance aspect, right? Like if quality is a continual process, right? Quality control. You need to make sure that you understand the data that you have, making sure, again, coming back to understand the relationships, what you have, but managing it over time. Some of the things that we've been implementing with customers is around on the data quality side. It's around the confidence that you have in your data over time. And so you really think about how you can store your data over time and see how it changed. Because part of that is making sure that you understand the data you have, how you govern that. Coming back to security though, from our perspective as a data platform company, security is very important to us. And from our healthcare side, from our financial institution side, all the regulations, we make sure that your data is secure at rest and also in transit. So there's a lot of key things around that. It's very easy, with cybersecurity issues these days, but having data comes with responsibility.
I think that basically data comes with two sides. One is an asset, the other is a liability. And the key point is, if the asset part, which is basically the good use of that you can do with data, is not big enough to offset the risk, which is the liability side, which is exactly that if something happens, you might lose. There's no point in keeping the data because then you have a liability that's much bigger, a risk, and then the asset that you have. There's no point in that. And I think that's the key way to approach or how to look at the question. I think the framework, in my view, is quite easy to understand. In order to implement that, that's not that easy because quite often you are not really sure how valuable that data is going to be until you have collected and really try to work with the data. But I think that after you've done that and nothing good came out of it, destroy it. There is no reason to keep it because then you still have the liability side and there's no asset. There's no point in that.
talking about that liability part, right? So that's why a lot of firms implement data retention policies, right? If you hold your data, I mean, I'm just taking one example, like a regulator, if you have the data, they're going to want to see it. So, a lot of times, the retention policy that's required is around whether it's 3 to 7 to 15 years. Well, you want to destroy it immediately after because, like you said, at a certain point, you already got all your use out of it. It can only be a liability afterwards, right? Because then you come back and look at it. So, that's a very good way of looking at it.
I love this because one perception we have, being MIT's loan management review and talking a lot about data governance and stuff like that, is that when people are starting to look at it, more specifically, as I suppose a lot of people that are watching this, it looks like the first behavior is this hoarding one, right? If data is important, I need to hoard it. I need to capture everything. So you go to this strange things like going maybe to hotel and people ask you for your CPF, which would be like your social security number. They just don't need it to do anything at all, or stuff like that. So I think it's pretty interesting, this vision you share, Ricardo and Michael, about the liability and asset side of stuff, because then hoarding becomes a huge risk, right?
Yeah, and I think that the hoarding part is key because we hear stories, for instance, of people who used to keep old newspapers. So they have and I mean in paper. There was a story. I used to live in New York City, and there was a story of someone in the city that at a certain point there was a structural problem in the building because the person was keeping the newspapers for decades, and it was heavy, very heavy. And so it was a serious problem. My whole point is the picture was amazing because there were those huge piles, and they need to move as if they were in I don't even know where, because they couldn't move in their own house because of hoarding. And it's not only physical data, but the same thing happens with digital data. It can be so much that it's a mess. It's a huge mess. It doesn't help. It's a liability. There's no point in it.
And since we're talking about getting the value out of data and when it is useful and when it is not, I'd like to ask a question that has a lot to do with the story that Ricardo shared about 1994, which is, what are the valuable practices or best practices? I don't know if there are any best practices for it, but about data in volatile scenarios. When longer term planning is maybe it doesn't work that much. So, for example, there's a lot of machine learning models that on March 2020 went bust, right? After COVID, it was useless most of the time. So what to do in these scenarios? Because, usually, like Ricardo said, if you have a good, maybe historical series, that's pretty good. But if people change currency in the middle of it, then what? So what to do in these cases? So Michael, Ricardo, from your experience, when things change a lot, what can you do?
So that brings up an interesting point around, I guess, the usage of all this automation, right? So, we need to be careful that there needs to be some kill switches, right? So you think about like certain algo shops, right? They're very automated, like 98, 99% of their trading is done through machinery, right? So they have a bunch of algos that continually run, but when something doesn't jive, right? It's out of the ordinary. You can have, as Ricardo mentioned before, it's just like you have this extraordinary loss because it didn't account for it properly. And I think that's where the balancing act between kind of humans and machines, where, granted, machines are very good at execution and processing, right? Like they're way faster than humans can do. But I think the balancing act is that you need to have, control and monitoring and control from a actual human, and that's where kind of I see and what we what we work with customers on is that balancing act, making sure that you can have this control, making sure that you can look at how things and be agile about it, because nothing's perfect, right? Your data is not perfect. You will have situations that are different, and you need to just make sure that you are, you're prepared to handle that. The other side of the fence is just speed and scale, right? Like a lot of situations during that, you mentioned kind of the beginning of the pandemic. A lot of companies couldn't handle that scale, right? And that just speaks to the new norm is volatility, right? And you need to make sure that your systems and you're able to process. Now that you're data driven, you need to be able to process that speed at the speed and scale. So those are kind of the two points that I want to make there.
I think that the key point there is to have data context, which means to understand if the data that you have, the prior data that you have, is under a similar context than the current situation you're going through. So to get the pandemics as an example, I think that there is one point or one sense that it was and one that it wasn't. And it's quite interesting because I remember quite well what I did when the pandemics hit, which was basically I tried to study as much as I could about previous pandemics. And the last important one was roughly 100 years prior to this one. And there was some data, very interesting data in terms of both some regions that tried to deal with it with lockdowns, some others that didn't, and what happened, what changed, because technology changed a lot in that sense. So I said, oh, how much is going to change? But the key point that I saw there, and not only that, because I actually went much further, I went to one important pandemics that had in the Roman Empire during the time that Marcus Aurelius was the emperor. It was a 15-year pandemic, 15 years. And the other one as well, it was basically 2.5 years. There were 3 different phases of the pandemics. And the whole point is, there was much more to learn with the data that was 100 years old, or in some cases more than 1,000 years old, than with the recent data as far as the pandemics is concerned. But as far as how financial markets react to that, then I don't think that we needed to go so much further in past to understand. What always happens is when you have a big negative event, the market overreacts. It always happens like that. And so basically what happened was same thing. The key point is you're never sure when exactly is the time that it has already overreacted. But exactly later on, what you see is that once it bounces, it really comes back much faster than what people realize. And this time it was even faster than historically. So my whole point is some of the financial data could help understand the kind of movement that the market happened before, not exactly never ever, but it does give you some very good hint about the future. So that's one thing. So what is the data that could help with that? Valuation data, in terms of changing prices data from the top to bottom. There was some data that could be very helpful, but in terms of understanding the pandemics itself, my understanding at that point, and I remember that quite well for one simple reason, because then when I saw that, what I said, guys, this is gonna take some years. But then everybody will say, no, in a couple of weeks, at most a couple of months, we're back to normal life because technology has changed. And I said, I don't understand anything about pandemics, so probably I'm the one who's getting this thing wrong. And now I know that if I had trusted what history has told me, what data has taught me at that point, I would have taken much better decisions than the one that I took, basically because that data was more relevant than the new data that most people were looking at.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, again, with technology the way it is today and all that data points that we have now historically, you can draw correlations and look at scenarios in the past, and you can see if, run past scenarios and see if there's any correlations to how it looked back then to what it is now. And so you can potentially draw conclusions. You know, you have to be careful how you draw those conclusions because it's not exactly the same, right? I think that's a very key point. And then I think that another point that Ricardo made, the rebounding effect is super fast now. Everything's accelerated. And that actually has to do, in my humble opinion, around algos, where we can trade that much faster. And it's not necessarily right? Because algos work against algos. So they look at market conditions and they just act, right? I'm not saying it's illogical, but then there's an amplified effect where it just goes that much more. Oh, market's moving up, let me buy, right? Market's going down, let me sell, right? I'm just simplifying it, but if that just makes why I said before, volatility is the new norm, because the way we're moving, everyone, just think of all actions moving that much faster. In a data-driven world, everything is moving faster. So you need to make sure that you know everything that you have can move that fast.
I think you brought an extremely important and interesting point, Michael, which is, in my view, the market reaction time basically depends on how fast information moves. So basically, back then, when Napoleon was trying to invade the UK and was not able to, and then there was a board that came with the information, and so that the Rothschild could trade that back in Paris. It took a couple of days for the board to cross. I'm not sure if a couple of days, but it took a long time for the board to cross the strait, how do we call that? Canal da Mancha. Anyway, I just forgot the name of it in English. But anyway, to cross between the UK and France. Now with the algos, we are talking about nanoseconds. So I totally agree with you that the reaction time has changed. The only point that I have a slight difference is I'm not sure if necessarily that brings more volatility all the time. I think it brings much larger volatility bounces. What I mean by that is that at certain points, this thing that all the algos are moving in the same direction actually causes the opposite things, which is big trending markets. But then it becomes extreme up to a certain point that something shifts the balance, and then you're absolutely right. Then volatility comes with a revenge. That's how my impression, again, my humble impression of how the algos are playing all that.
Yeah, it's that magnitude, right? Like, yeah, I totally agree. Like, it isn't always given that it's going to be, increased volatility. It's really, again, how each algo is acting against each other, right? So you have all, think about the participants all around, right? It could be all aligned or it could be countering, and then you reduce that. So
thinking now, I think it's the second derivative. It's the volatility of volatility that has increased. It's how fast it can change. It's not really volatility itself.
Love the calculus part by the end of it. I think it sets the tone on what is needed, right? I think the one thing that I can get from this conversation is there's this whole set of skills and understandings that we need to have right now that we probably shouldn't, maybe 10 years ago. So for example, I was having this conversation in our editorial board, and there's this amazing guys in the editorial board that, some of them kind of brought the internet to Brazil. And one of the things we were talking about is how it's, unless you have at least the basics and statistics, you're probably not going to be able to have the conversation with the person that you're going to need to, that's going to create something for you. There's going to create a model for you or something like that. Or maybe the basics of, technology, what is possible, what's not possible. So I think there's one thing that's pretty interesting that I also got from this conversation is there's a thing about fluency, right? I think we're probably going to need some different fluencies that we had maybe a couple of years ago, right?
I think you're absolutely right. But I'm not sure if it was that different before. What I mean by that is that maybe now it might be even more important, but I think it has always been important, Because even let me give you an example of in practice, the survivorship bias that I mentioned that is going on right now. So, Michael, there are many people in Brazil who say that the best way to deal with COVID is what they call a previous treatment, which here in Brazil is called the COVID kit, which is basically in hydroxychloroquine, which basically the tests have proven it doesn't work. Why so many people in Brazil still believe it does? Because they know someone who used and got quite well. The only problem is 80% of those who get COVID don't have any symptoms. So there is a 4-against-1 probability that nothing is going to happen. And if it happens to be someone who has taken the medicine, they would be well anyway. But they say, oh, it was because they have taken
this. Right?
Yeah, and in terms of mortality, it's even worse because roughly it's 3% of those who get in Brazil, which hasn't done a good job in fighting it. It's 3% of those who get the illness who eventually come to die. So you say, oh, they took the medicine and they're good, they're alive, it worked. Yeah, there was a 32-against-1 probability. If they didn't take it, it would work. So if people don't understand, basically they don't understand data, they come to the wrong conclusions. And the big thing is they fight hardly about this thing. So one key point is, I think that is more important than ever, is that for all of us, we need to have clear understanding of what we know and especially what we don't. So, but it's very hard for someone to admit, I don't understand how numbers relate to themselves. They think they do, and they come to absolutely the wrong conclusions. It's very similar to the story of the airplanes and where the airplanes got shot. It's basically the same story.
You know, I love that point because, you know, when we say data driven, like you want to just move and be, I wouldn't say like somewhat scientific, right? Like it's what the data says, right? Misinterpretation can be very dangerous, right? Like if, yeah, one guy survived, but 1,000 died, but the treatment's good, right? So it's kind of like, you need to make sure that you, again, coming back to the context of your data, making sure you're first and foremost, you have good data. But then it's how you interpret, what's the relationships of it? How do you interpret the data? I think that's very key to kind of, in multiple cases, multiple industries, right? Like it just applies. You need to make sure that you can have that data, but also use it appropriately, right? Draw the right conclusions, positive and negative.
And I think that a key point is to understand the difference between anecdote and data. Because the story of one guy, whatever it is, that's not data. That's one guy. And I think
that's misinterpretation, right?
Yes, exactly. But I think that in terms of the financial industry, that can be quite important because sometimes some new financial, especially in terms of pricing and market dynamics, market pricing dynamics, because what happens is that sometimes a new product arrives and the history of it is quite short. And you come to totally wrong conclusions, basically, because you don't have history enough to come to any conclusion. Let me get an example. The global financial crisis was originated basically by that, because the whole story was you can create some real estate market derivatives based on the idea that the market is local. And if it is local, you can slice that in. And there is no problem, because if you get some of your real estate credit based on one is in New York, the risk is very low. Why? Because until that point, there was no national real estate crisis in the US. Until it hits, it was out of your data. So the conclusion was totally wrong. And it almost brought the whole global financial markets to its heels. So I think it's important because in general, financial history data is short. And we tend to come to very definitive conclusions based on short-term data, and that's very dangerous. Very, very dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, you can even draw conclusions to kind of current day, right? So think of humans and machinery that are, like you said, acting on either misinterpreted data or not enough data, right? And that gets amplified. So if you think of sophisticated models, well, what if you had a not very sophisticated model that just says, if the market goes up, I will buy. If the market goes down, I will sell. You know, that really kind of starts to have some very broad ramifications. You know, you talk about
That's
Robinhood.
basically what amplifies momentum. And many
Right.
market. And by the way, that's a model which is not very different from the one that I mentioned. My model was much more complicated, but the result was similar to that one, because this model that you mentioned, how it works, most of the times it's going to be right. The problem is, again, when it's going to be wrong, it's going to be dead wrong, because it's when the market shifts. So it would be very similar to the one that I mentioned. It would make money most of the days, and when it lost, you're gonna lose several days. If you could understand that, that's okay, that's all right. But if you didn't know that, despite the fact that it was right very often, and when it would be eventually wrong, and it will eventually be wrong, you're gonna lose much more money than in the days that you're right. Then you're gonna lose. You're gonna be ruined, because you're gonna say, "Oh, it's right so many times, so let's bet big," and then you're broken.
No, 100% agree there. Pedro, you're on mute.
Sorry.
You're
There we
muted.
go.
Sometimes it always happens in
It's not a conference if someone hasn't spoken on mute.
Exactly. So I just inaugurated it. So, but folks, it's been amazing to host this conversation between both of you. I've been learning a lot throughout this time. I unfortunately, people are going to be mad at me because I totally lost track of it, and we're like 7 minutes after our time. But I didn't want to lose any of those wisdom nuggets that you both had about data, about finance, and about everything about it, and about this mindset that we're going to need, be it in the financial markets or not, that we are going to need even more during those times. So I'd like to thank you, so very much for participating with us. It's been such a pleasure and an honor to host this conversation. Of course, open for both of you, some final remarks or some, bye-bye or whatever you prefer. So please go for it, Ricardo, Michael, whichever wants to be the first. It's been a pleasure.
Here's Michael.
Ricardo, well, thank you. It was a very interesting and engaging conversation, so thank you. Pedro, thank you for moderating and hosting this. So it was a very informative for me, and hopefully for all our audience. Thank you.
I just want to say that I've learned a lot. I'm still much more stupid than the guy that you mentioned in the beginning of our talk, but I'm less stupid than I was when I joined. So thank you for both of us for that.
Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you to all of our attendees, and have a great night, you all. Thank you again. It's been an honor.
And be safe.
Bye-bye. Be safe.
You too. Thanks.